Now let's shift our focus to a tragic incident that took place in the U.S. state of Nebraska. Adult film actor Jay Hefner was tragically shot dead in an incident described by his family as a senseless act of gun violence.
5:37 in the morning when a 24-year-old man died in a Lincoln, Nebraska hospital 3 hours after leaving a downtown bar on foot. He had flown in from California days earlier for a family birthday. He was supposed to fly home. Instead, his name would end up in a homicide file, and to the surprise of nearly everyone who read about it afterward, in entertainment headlines around the world. This is the story of what happened to him, what investigators found, and what still, more than a year later, remains unanswered. He was born Savion Hopkins. To a growing audience online, he was known as Jay Hefner, a name he built in music and in adult entertainment, a career that made him recognizable to strangers on the other side of the country. But the people who actually knew him describe someone almost entirely different from a public persona. They describe a young father devoted to his 10-month-old daughter. They describe a son who helped care for his mother through a terminal illness, and a brother who stepped in to help raise his younger siblings while she was sick. Whatever else his public career made of him, at home he was simply Savion, someone people depended on, and someone who seemed to want it that way. In September of 2024, he traveled from his home in Ontario, California, to Lincoln, Nebraska, to celebrate a family birthday. It was meant to be a short, unremarkable trip. He was scheduled to fly back within days. Nothing about the visit suggested it would end in a homicide investigation that would eventually widen into a federal case involving more than a dozen people. Early on the morning of September 8th, in the entertainment district near 11th and P Streets, a fight broke out on the sidewalk outside a bar called the Highball. Witnesses, among them a former University of Nebraska basketball player who happened to be nearby, told police they saw a chaotic scene. Several men fighting, a crowd gathering, officers on patrol being waved down to break it up. For a moment, it looked like it might end there, with nothing worse than bruises and a police report. It didn't, according to investigators. Hopkins was standing near the fight alongside two other men, but was not himself part of the altercation. One of those two men, prosecutors would later allege, briefly stepped into the fight himself, then turned back toward the other two, pointed, and said two words, "Shoot him." What happened next took only seconds. A handgun came out. Two shots rang out into the crowd. Hopkins was struck in the chest. A second man, a Lincoln resident in his 40s standing nearby, was also hit, though his injuries were not life-threatening. In the days after, family members would describe Hopkins as having intervened that night to protect a relative from harm, a detail that spread widely in early coverage of his death. But it's a detail investigators have never publicly confirmed. To this day, the precise relationship between Hopkins and the men beside him on that sidewalk, and whether he was protecting anyone at all or simply in the wrong place at the wrong moment, remains one of the case's central, unresolved questions. Police arrived to find both wounded men and rushed them to a local hospital. Hopkins was pronounced dead at 5:37 that morning. He had crossed nearly 2,000 miles for a birthday celebration. He never made it to the flight home. For a brief period, police withheld his identity while family was notified. When his name did become public, the story took on a different shape almost immediately, because Savion Hopkins was not simply another homicide victim in a college town. He was Jay Hefner, an adult film performer and rapper with a substantial online following. The seventh homicide in Lincoln that year had, virtually overnight, become an international story, less because of where he died and more because of who the world discovered he'd been. Tributes came from two very different directions at once. His girlfriend, Madeline, wrote publicly about losing the person she had built a future with. Friends of his mother remembered him as a bright light for the people who loved him. A fundraiser was set up to help cover funeral costs, compounding an already difficult financial situation the family was managing because of his mother's illness. Donations poured in from fans who had never met him and from people who had known him his entire life, an unusual convergence of public mourning and private grief. Behind the headlines, the investigation moved carefully. Detectives with the Lincoln Police Department gathered surveillance footage from businesses near the scene. They conducted dozens of witness interviews. Slowly, a picture emerged, not of a random act of violence against a stranger, but of three men standing together in the middle of a chaotic scene, only one of whom would walk away afterward. 5 weeks after the shooting, in mid-October, arrest warrants were issued for two men from Omaha, 23-year-old Savion Wright and 30-year-old Gregory Bahati. Acting alongside the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force and the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, investigators took both men into custody. Wright was charged as the shooter, first-degree murder, use of a firearm to commit a felony, and 2 counts of second-degree assault, covering both Hopkins and the second wounded man. Bahati was charged as an accomplice, accused of directing Wright's attention and his gun toward Hopkins in the instant before the shots were fired. Searches of both men's homes turned up 2 handguns and a rifle. At arraignment, a judge denied bond for both. Investigators noted that the two had ties to gangs in Omaha, though whether the shooting itself was gang-motivated was something police said, at the time, they could not confirm. In January of 2025, prosecutors amended the charges against Bahati, elevating him from an aiding and abetting theory to a direct first-degree murder charge, a legal maneuver that didn't change the potential sentence he faced, but shifted what the state would need to prove at trial. By spring, pretrial hearings were already testing the strength of that theory. Bahati's defense argued that a single shouted phrase in the middle of a chaotic street fight didn't meet the legal threshold for aiding and abetting a killing. Prosecutors disagreed. It wasn't encouragement, they argued. It was a directive. Then, in November of 2025, the case shifted again, and this time dramatically. The state charges against both Wright and Bahati were dismissed in Lancaster County District Court, not because the case against them had weakened, but because federal prosecutors had stepped in. Newly unsealed filings revealed that both men had been indicted on federal charges, including murder in aid of racketeering, alongside 11 other individuals, all connected to the Omaha area. The full nature of the alleged criminal enterprise and how those 11 others relate to the killing of Savion Hopkins has not been made public. The federal complaint remains sealed. As of now, no trial date has been set, and no verdict has been reached in either the state or federal proceedings. The central question of why Savion Hopkins died on that sidewalk, targeted, mistaken, or caught in something larger, remains open more than a year and a half after his death. What hasn't changed, through every twist in the legal process, is the size of what was lost. A little girl, not yet a year old when her father died, who will know him only through the memories of the people who loved him. A mother, already fighting a terminal illness, now grieving the son who had been helping her carry it. A downtown Lincoln community forced to reckon with its 7th homicide of the year, one of several violent incidents that fall in a stretch of the city usually known for nightlife, not headlines, and an audience of strangers scattered across music and entertainment fanbases who found themselves mourning someone they had only ever known through a screen and learning, only in his absence, how much more there had been to him. By every account from the people who actually knew him, Savion Hopkins was someone who showed up for others, for his daughter, for his mother, for his siblings, and if his family's account holds, for whoever he was standing beside that night. Whether that instinct is what put him in the path of a bullet may never be fully settled by the facts as they currently stand. What the record does show, clearly, is a life shaped by responsibility to the people who depended on him, cut short in seconds outside, a bar most of the country had never heard of, in a case that, even now, continues to widen rather than close.